Tonight we journey into a forgotten and haunted corner of American history, to a time when the infant republic was stumbling toward its identity, and vast fortunes were carved out by men either daring enough, or perhaps damned enough, to seize what others dared not touch. The ink of the Constitution had barely dried. The echoes of liberty, still fresh and fragile, whispered through the 13 states. But through the drawing rooms and shadowed alleys of Charleston, another whisper moved. A darker whisper. It spoke of a family whose ascent defied every natural law, of gatherings held beneath the silent witness of midnight, of strange, flickering lights deep in the marshlands, of people who simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. This is the story of the Bellamy Dynasty, and the secret cult that built their empire on blood. The year was 1790. Along the coast of South Carolina, wealth glistened like morning dew on the vast rice plantations and through the thriving networks of maritime trade. The revolution had come and gone, leaving in its wake a young nation, brimming with ambition, and the heady promise of reinvention. Charleston streets teemed with life, merchants hawking goods, sailors fresh off salt, crusted ships, politicians murmuring in corners, planters surveying their dominion, all of them navigating the delicate dance between the old aristocratic order and the raw, untested ideals of democracy. Carriages clattered over cobblestones, their wheels sending up sprays from puddles left by the afternoon's violent thunderstorms. Ladies in fine silk strolled beneath parasols, while gentlemen in tailored waistcoats discussed futures and fortunes on the steps of the Exchange building. But beneath this polished veneer, something ancient stirred. In the swamps and forests beyond the city's lamplight, older powers waited, remnants of forgotten beliefs mingled with new fears. Slaves, torn from West African shores, whispered to their children of spirits older than any master's god, powers the white man could never comprehend. And in certain locked drawing rooms, behind heavy curtains, wealthy men and women dabbled in mysteries that would have horrified their pious neighbors. None knew these mysteries more intimately than the Bellamy family of Raven's Rest Plantation. 20 miles northwest of Charleston, their grand, white-columned mansion rose atop a gentle hill, surrounded by endless fields of Carolina gold rice. By day, it shimmered like a green, gold sea under the southern sun, the very picture of prosperity and gentility. But by night, especially when the moon hid her face, it became something else entirely. Thaddeus Bellamy had arrived in the colonies in 1760, a man of modest means, but extraordinary vision. The records in Charleston's maritime office describe him simply as a merchant of London, some 30 years of age, possessing a single vessel. That vessel, the Midnight Star, was a 3-masted schooner well past her prime, her hull barnacled, her sails patched in a dozen places. Yet within a year, Thaddeus had established a lucrative trade route between Charleston, Jamaica, and Barbados. Where other merchants lost ships to storms or pirates, the Midnight Star always returned, her hold brimming with exotic goods that commanded premium prices. Some whispered Thaddeus had an uncanny gift for reading the weather, always sending his ship out before fair winds, calling her back before the tempest struck. Others murmured he'd made a deal with the pirates, who plagued those waters, offering something more valuable than cargo in exchange for safe passage. A few, in the darkest corners of taverns, spoke of rituals performed in the privacy of his counting house as the moon waned toward darkness. Within a decade, he was a merchant of renown. The Midnight Star had been joined by 5 sister vessels, all plying the Atlantic with improbable success. His counting house on East Bay Street employed a dozen clerks. His name appeared on the rolls of Charleston's most exclusive society, the Satine, Cecilia, despite the shadows clinging to his past. When asked about his family in England, Thaddeus would offer only a thin, tight-lipped smile and change the subject, leaving his questioner with the unmistakable sense that further inquiry would be deeply unwelcome. By 1775, as revolutionary fever swept the colonies, Thaddeus had amassed enough wealth to purchase Raven's Rest, a dying plantation whose owner, Sir William Hargrove, had fled back to England, fearing the coming storm. The estate had fallen into ruined fields untended, slave quarters half empty. The main house, once a regional pride, was peeling and overgrown. But most unsettling to the locals was the ancient stone structure at the edge of the property. A relic from the previous century, some said built by Spanish explorers, others claimed it predated European arrival entirely. The local Cusso, Natchez tribes avoided it entirely, calling it the house where shadows live. Hargrove had used it as a storehouse, though his overseer confided that the master never ventured near it after sunset. Thaddeus, however, was immediately drawn to it. Within days of taking possession, he had the building cleared and refurbished, installing iron brackets in the walls and placing a heavy oak table at the room's center. When questioned, he claimed it would serve as a special processing facility for a new strain of rice, one requiring particular handling during certain lunar phases. The purchase raised eyebrows. Despite his wealth, Thaddeus was still an outsider, a merchant trying to claw his way into the planter aristocracy, and buying property as war loomed seemed foolhardy. Rice plantations demanded constant labor, and war would surely disrupt both workforce and markets. Yet Thaddeus seemed untroubled. He proceeded with renovations and acquired more slaves, moving with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how events would unfold. While other plantations suffered during the war, Raven's Rest flourished. The British blockade that strangled Charleston's harbor barely touched him. His ships slipped through, bringing supplies he distributed with an eye always toward building goodwill and influence. When the British occupied Charleston in 1780, he maintained cordial relations with their officers while secretly feeding intelligence to the Continentals. When the occupation ended, he was equally welcome in the homes of patriots, his loyalty seemingly beyond question, despite his English birth. Even more remarkable was the plantation's prosperity. Thaddeus seemed able to avoid British patrols at will. His crops never failed, even when drought or flood devastated neighboring lands. And the slaves at Raven's Rest, who had arrived sullen and rebellious, now worked with an eerie, mechanical efficiency. They moved through the fields in unnatural silence, eyes downcast, responding to every command with instant obedience. Visitors remarked on it, but Thaddeus merely smiled and credited his lightened management. Once a month at the new moon, Thaddeus would select one of the strongest male slaves and bring him to the stone building for what he called special duties. Those men never returned to the quarters. When asked, Thaddeus would explain they'd been sent to work on his ships or sold inland. The other slaves never spoke of them, not even in whispers. Their silence was perhaps the most unnerving thing of all. By 1790, Raven's Rest sprawled across over 5,000 acres, its soil yielding the finest Carolina gold in the region. The once decaying manor had been transformed into a showplace. White columns gleaming, interiors adorned with imported art and furnishings. Formal gardens surrounded the house, blooming with exotic plants that should not have thrived in Carolina's climate, but did. Their strange blossoms filled the night air with a cloying, almost sickly sweetness. Thaddeus was a striking figure, tall and lean, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. At 60, he retained a vigor that younger men envied. His thick hair, once mahogany, had silvered at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished authority. His hands were those of a scholar, long-fingered, uncaloused, nails immaculately clean. And his voice, a deep, melodious instrument that could charm the wary or soothe the frightened. When Thaddeus Bellamy spoke, people listened, often agreeing to terms they'd never intended to accept. His wife, Constance, was 20 years his junior. A beauty with raven hair and alabaster skin, she rarely left the plantation. She had appeared in Charleston society shortly after the war, introduced as the daughter of a French merchant from New Orleans. They had married quickly, without the customary courtship. Rumors whispered she'd been pregnant, though no child arrived for a full year. Constance was as reserved as Thaddeus was sociable. At the rare gatherings she attended, she spoke little, watching with dark, knowing eyes that made guests uneasy. She dressed in the height of fashion, but always in dark colors, midnight blues, deep purples, blacks that made her pale skin seem to glow. Around her throat, she always wore a peculiar silver pendant etched with symbols unlike any known alphabet. When asked, she would touch it lightly and murmur it was a family heirloom, too precious to remove. They had 3 children. Nathaniel, the eldest at 25, shared his father's commanding height. Victoria, 22, possessed her mother's ethereal beauty, and young Thomas, just 16, seemed a perfect blend. Thaddeus's piercing eyes in a face shaped by Constance's delicate features. The Bellamys were known for their philanthropy. They funded churches and schools throughout the region. St. Michael's received a magnificent pipe organ from Thaddeus in 1787. The Charleston Orphan House counted Constance among its most generous benefactors. A school for daughters of less fortunate gentlemen opened thanks to Victoria's patronage, while Nathaniel sponsored a new wing at the city's hospital. These acts earned them the gratitude of Charleston's citizens and the admiration of their peers. Few questioned the source of their inexhaustible wealth, accepting Thaddeus's explanations of fortunate investments and efficient management. They hosted lavish gatherings at Raven's Rest, where the elite marveled at the family's art collection and the strange antiquities Thaddeus had gathered on his travels. Displayed in glass cases throughout the mansion were artifacts any museum would covet: Egyptian canopic jars with animal-headed stoppers, Grecian amphorae depicting scenes of bacchanalian excess, African masks whose expressions seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, Columbian stone carvings depicting rituals too disturbing for close examination. Thaddeus would guide his guests through this private museum with evident pride, sharing tales of each acquisition, stories often hinting at dangers overcome and forbidden knowledge obtained. He presented himself as a scholar of ancient civilizations, particularly fascinated by their religious practices and beliefs about the afterlife. Most guests found his enthusiasm charming, if perhaps a trifle eccentric. The highlight was always dinner in the grand dining room, beneath a chandelier of Venetian crystal. The table, seating 30, gleamed with silver and fine china. Footmen moved silently, filling glasses with vintages imported from France, serving courses prepared by a chef brought from New Orleans. The food was exquisite, though some dishes featured flavors unfamiliar, even to well-traveled guests. When complimented, Thaddeus would smile enigmatically and mention connections to traders from the Far East or Caribbean herbalists who supplied his kitchen with rare ingredients. Yet whispers followed the family like persistent shadows. Why did the laborers at Raven's Rest never attempt escape, when those at other plantations regularly fled? Why did Thaddeus insist on maintaining that crumbling stone structure locals called the Witch House? And what happened during the new moon, when no visitors were permitted and even trusted house servants were confined to their quarters? Our story truly begins with the arrival of Dr. Jonathan Blackwood to the Charleston area in early 1790. A physician trained at the University of Edinburgh, Blackwood had come to America seeking new opportunities after a scandal forced him to leave Scotland. The nature of that scandal remains murky, but rumors suggested it involved forbidden research into the reanimation of dead tissue. Inspired by Luigi Galvani's experiments on animal electricity, which had both fascinated and disturbed the medical community. Blackwood was a man of science in an age when the boundaries between science, philosophy, and what we might now call the occult were still fluid. His personal journals, discovered decades later in a Boston attic, reveal a mind unwilling to accept conventional limitations. There must be more to life and death than the church would have us believe, he wrote. The electrical fluid that animates our muscles, the essence that departs upon our last breath. These are not supernatural phenomena, but natural processes we have yet to understand, and what can be understood can be manipulated. In appearance, Blackwood cut a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a shock of prematurely white hair that contrasted with his youthful face. He dressed simply but well, favoring dark colors that complemented his serious demeanor. His hands, large and capable, possessed the steadiness required of a surgeon. His eyes, gray as a winter sea, missed nothing. He spoke with the slight burr of Edinburgh's old town, an accent Charlestonians found both foreign and charming. Blackwood established a practice in Charleston, where his medical knowledge and Scottish charm quickly earned him entry into society. His treatments, blending traditional methods with progressive techniques, produced results other physicians couldn't match. He was particularly successful with fevers and infections, using tinctures and compounds of his own devising. If some patients reported unusual dreams or sensations afterward, they considered it a small price for recovery from ailments that might otherwise prove fatal. It was at a springtime ball at the governor's mansion that he first encountered the Bellamys, specifically Victoria, whose beauty and wit captivated him instantly. The event celebrated South Carolina's ratification of the Constitution, drawing the state's most prominent families in a display of patriotic unity. The ballroom glittered with candlelight reflected in crystal chandeliers and ladies' jewels. Musicians played minuets and country dances, while servants circulated with trays of champagne. Victoria stood apart, not merely for her beauty, though that was considerable, but for the intensity that surrounded her like an aura. While other young women tittered behind fans and cast demure glances at potential suitors, Victoria observed the proceedings with the cool assessment of a chess player considering her next move. Her gown, a deep crimson bordering on black in the candlelight, was cut in the latest Parisian fashion, lower than Charleston propriety typically allowed. Around her throat, she wore a silver chain with a pendant similar to her mother's, though Victoria's bore different symbols, angular shapes that seemed to draw the eye into their complexity. Blackwood found himself moving toward her as if pulled by an invisible thread. When their eyes met across the room, he felt a jolt of recognition, though certain they had never met. Something passed between them. A shared understanding, perhaps, or a mutual acknowledgement of difference. Whatever it was, it compelled him to approach and request a dance. Their dance was the talk of Charleston for weeks. The elegant doctor and the planter's daughter moving across the floor, with such grace that others stopped to watch. They barely spoke during the minuet, communicating instead through glances and the subtle pressure of hands. When the music ended, Victoria smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face from beautiful to breathtaking. "You're not like the others, Doctor Blackwood," she said, her voice low and melodious. "You see beyond the veil that blinds most men." "And what veil is that, Miss Bellamy?" he asked, intrigued. "The comfortable illusion that we understand the world and our place in it." She glanced around at the other guests. "These people live in a dollhouse of their own making, playing at lives they believe are important. But there are greater powers at work, greater purposes to serve." Her dark eyes returned to his. "I think you know this already." Before he could respond, Thaddeus appeared at his daughter's side. "Victoria, my dear, you must introduce me to your new acquaintance," he said. Though his expression suggested he already knew exactly who Blackwood was. In the days that followed, Blackwood found himself thinking of Victoria constantly. Her enigmatic words had stirred something within him. A recognition of his own dissatisfaction with conventional explanations. He had come to America hoping to escape European constraints, to find new approaches to old questions. Perhaps the Bellamys, with their evident unorthodoxy, might offer insights he had not considered. He began riding out to Raven's Rest, ostensibly to treat minor ailments, but truly to catch glimpses of the enchanting young woman. His first visit came in response to a convenient summons. Constance Bellamy was suffering from migraines, and the family's regular physician was unavailable. Blackwood arrived on a morning in late April, the air heavy with magnolia blossoms and the drone of bees among the flowering bushes lining the drive. A slave met him at the door. A middle-aged man whose face bore no expression whatsoever, not even the customary mask of deference. His eyes seemed unfocused, looking at Blackwood yet not seeing him. When he spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of the musical cadence typical of Carolina slaves. "The mistress awaits you in her chambers, doctor," he said, the words precise yet mechanical. "Follow me." As Blackwood moved through the house, he noted the unusual silence. A home this size typically buzzed with activity. Servants cleaning, children playing, the hundred small sounds of domestic life. Raven's Rest, by contrast, seemed to absorb sound. The thick carpets and heavy draperies created an atmosphere more like a church than a home. Constance Bellamy's bedroom was a study in controlled light. Multiple layers of curtains admitted only faint illumination, casting the space in perpetual twilight. The air smelled of incense, not the frankincense of Christian worship, but something more exotic, a blend of spices and resins Blackwood couldn't identify. Constance herself lay on a canopied bed, her dark hair spread across pillows, her pale skin luminous in the dim light. "Dr. Blackwood," she murmured as he entered, her voice surprisingly strong for one supposedly suffering severe headaches. "How kind of you to attend me." Blackwood approached, medical bag in hand. "Mrs. Bellamy, I understand you've been experiencing migraines, among other ailments." She replied, her dark eyes assessing him with an intensity that belied her supine position. "But I find my condition improving already, now that you're here." The examination that followed was unlike any Blackwood had conducted. Constance answered his questions with cryptic statements designed to provoke rather than inform. When he inquired about the duration of her headaches, she smiled and said, "Time is such a flexible concept, don't you agree, doctor? What feels like moments to one consciousness might be eternities to another." When he asked about the quality of the pain, she described it as the pressure of knowledge seeking release. Throughout, Blackwood had the distinct impression that he was the one being evaluated. Constance watched his every move with those fathomless eyes, seeming to note his reactions to her strange responses. At one point, she reached out and grasped his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers pressing against his pulse. "Your heart beats with unusual regularity, doctor," she observed. It suggests a man of discipline, or perhaps one whose blood carries something extra. Thaddeus seemed amused by the doctor's interest in his daughter, even encouraging Blackwood to join them for dinner on several occasions. It was during one such dinner, in late April, that Blackwood first noticed the peculiarities of the Bellamy household. The family drank a strange tea before each meal, served in cups of tarnished silver bearing symbols Blackwood did not recognize. The servants moved with eerie synchronicity, their eyes never meeting those of the family or guests. And most disturbing, Blackwood could have sworn that as Thaddeus raised his glass in a toast, the older man's reflection in the dining room mirror remained motionless for just a moment too long. After dinner, as was the custom, the men retired to Thaddeus's study for brandy. It was a remarkable room, its walls lined with books in languages Blackwood recognized but could not read: ancient Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and others whose alphabets were entirely foreign. Glass cases displayed objects belonging in a museum: Egyptian scarabs, Roman coins, arrowheads of obvious antiquity, clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, and most striking, a dagger whose curved blade seemed to absorb rather than reflect candlelight. The handle was carved from some dark material, not wood or bone, but something resembling obsidian, yet subtly flexible to the touch. Wrapped around it was a thin gold wire inscribed with symbols similar to those on the teacups. The study smelled of leather and parchment, pipe tobacco and beeswax, creating an atmosphere of scholarly comfort that belied the strangeness of its contents. A fire burned in the large fireplace, though the evening was mild, casting dancing shadows across the oriental carpet. Thaddeus offered Blackwood a seat in one of two leather armchairs positioned before the hearth, then poured generous measures of brandy from a crystal decanter. "You seem a man of considerable learning, Dr. Blackwood," Thaddeus observed, settling into the other chair. "Edinburgh is known for its medical school, of course, but I sense your studies extended beyond the conventional curriculum." Blackwood sipped his brandy, considering his response. The liquor was exceptional, warming his throat, spreading pleasant heat through his chest. "I've always believed that medicine must embrace new ideas to advance," he said carefully. "Some of my research in Scotland was considered unorthodox. Unorthodox enough to necessitate your departure, I understand." Thaddeus smiled, showing teeth too white and perfect for a man his age. "You needn't be concerned. Charleston's society is far less rigid than Edinburgh's. Here, a man of vision may pursue his interests without the constraints of old-world thinking." He leaned forward, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Tell me, Doctor, have you continued your experiments since arriving in America?" The question startled Blackwood. He had been discreet about his past, offering only vague explanations for his relocation. "I'm not sure what you've heard, Mr. Bellamy, but I make it my business to know about interesting newcomers to Charleston," Thaddeus interrupted smoothly, "particularly those with minds that might appreciate the kind of knowledge I've accumulated." He gestured to the shelves surrounding them. "These books contain wisdom that most men cannot comprehend. Secrets of life and death, of time and dimension, of powers that the Church has spent centuries trying to suppress. You have quite the collection, Mr. Bellamy," Blackwood remarked, gesturing to a particularly unusual item. A small statue of a seated figure with the head of a bird, made of a greenish metal resembling tarnished copper. It seemed to shift hue as the firelight played across its surface. Despite its small size, no larger than a man's hand, it possessed a presence that drew the eye and held it. Yes," Thaddeus replied, his voice smooth as honey. "A gift from an associate in New Orleans. It is said to represent one of the spirits of voodoo. The Africans brought their gods with them to these shores, you know. Old gods. Hungry gods. He lifted the statuette from its place, cradling it with reverence bordering on devotion. This particular deity is associated with crossroads and transitions, with doors between worlds. The natives of Santo Domingo call him Baron Samedi, though he has older names. Much older. Thaddeus passed the statuette to Blackwood, who was surprised by its weight and the cold emanating from the metal despite the room's warmth. As his fingers closed around it, he felt a subtle vibration, as if the object contained some interior movement or energy. For just a moment, he thought he saw the bird-headed figure turn slightly to look at him. The impression vanished when he blinked. Remarkable craftsmanship, Blackwood murmured, returning the unsettling object. The level of detail suggests a highly developed artistic tradition. Indeed. Thaddeus replaced the statuette with evident care. These primitive cultures possess knowledge that would astonish our so-called civilized society. They understand that the world we perceive is merely the surface of a much deeper reality, that there are entities and energies beyond our normal senses. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. Do you believe in old gods, Dr. Blackwood? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implication. Blackwood felt himself at a crossroads of his own, one path leading to conventional platitudes about Christian faith, the other into territory that might be dangerous, but also illuminating. His scientific curiosity warred with instinctive caution. I believe, he said finally, that human history is longer and stranger than our current philosophies acknowledge. Whether the powers our ancestors worshipped were divine, or simply natural phenomena they lacked the vocabulary to explain, that remains an open question. Thaddeus's smile widened, revealing those perfect teeth again. A diplomatic answer, Doctor, but I think you and I both know that some questions can only be answered through direct experience. He raised his glass to open minds and new discoveries. Before Blackwood could respond, Nathaniel Bellamy entered the study, his face flushed with anger, or perhaps fear. Unlike his father's controlled elegance, Nathaniel's entrance was abrupt, the door banging against the wall as he thrust it open. His clothing was disheveled, his waistcoat unbuttoned, his neckcloth askew, as if he had dressed in haste. Most striking was his expression, a combination of panic and resignation that transformed his usually handsome features into a mask of distress. Father, he said tersely, there's been an incident at the witch house. Jenkins says it cannot wait until morning. The change in Thaddeus was immediate and striking. The urbane host vanished, replaced by something colder, more calculating. His eyes narrowed, the blue darkening to almost black in the firelight. His posture stiffened, the relaxed comfort giving way to coiled tension that reminded Blackwood of a predator preparing to strike. What kind of incident? Thaddeus asked, his voice low and controlled. Nathaniel glanced at Blackwood, clearly reluctant to speak in front of the visitor. One of the subjects has experienced an unexpected reaction to the treatment. Jenkins attempted the usual corrective measures, without success. I see. Thaddeus set down his brandy glass with deliberate care. And the timing. Less than an hour ago. Jenkins says the pattern is unprecedented. Nathaniel's voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying anxiety his forced composure could not conceal. A shadow crossed Thaddeus's face. A flicker of something that might have been genuine concern or merely irritation at the disruption. Very well. Please excuse me, Doctor. Nathaniel will keep you company. With that, he swept from the room, his movements fluid and purposeful, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Nathaniel crossed to the brandy decanter, his hands visibly shaking as he poured himself a measure. Unlike his father, the younger Bellamy was stocky and red-faced, with none of Thaddeus's aristocratic bearing. Where Thaddeus moved with predatory grace, Nathaniel's gestures were abrupt and forceful, betraying a temperament suited more to action than contemplation. His eyes, a paler blue than his father's, darted around the room as if seeking escape from an uncomfortable situation. He drained the glass in one swallow, then immediately refilled it. The brandy seemed to steady him somewhat, the flush in his cheeks fading from alarm to mere discomfort. Finally, he turned to Blackwood, attempting a smile that came across as more of a grimace. "So, you're the physician who's been calling on my sister," he said abruptly, dropping into the chair his father had vacated. "Victoria has mentioned you several times. I admire Miss Bellamy greatly." Blackwood replied cautiously, unsure of Nathaniel's mood or intentions. "She has a remarkable mind." Nathaniel snorted, a surprisingly inelegant sound. "That she does. Too remarkable, some might say. She takes after father in that regard." He studied Blackwood with narrowed eyes. "What exactly are your intentions toward my sister, doctor?" "My intentions are honorable." Blackwood replied somewhat stiffly. "I enjoy Miss Bellamy's company and conversation. Beyond that, I would not presume without your father's blessing." Nathaniel refilled his glass. "A word of advice, doctor. There are things about this family you would not understand. Things that would disturb you. Victoria is not for you, or any man outside our circle. Best you focus your attentions elsewhere." The warning was clear, but it only intensified Blackwood's curiosity. What circle did Nathaniel refer to? What aspects of the Bellamy family would disturb an educated man of science? Before he could frame a response that might elicit more information without seeming confrontational, a sound shattered the tense atmosphere. A scream echoed from somewhere on the grounds. A sound of such terror and agony that both men started. It was not the cry of an animal, or the shout of a worker disciplined for some infraction. This was the sound of a human being in the extremity of suffering. A wail that began as a word, perhaps please or no, and dissolved into raw expression of pain that raised the hair on Blackwood's arms. The scream lingered, seeming to bounce off the walls of the study, then cut off with such suddenness that the silence afterward felt like physical pressure against the eardrums. Nathaniel's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. Amber liquid splashed across the oriental carpet. The sharp smell of brandy rising to mingle with the room's scholarly odors. Nathaniel made no move to clean up the spill, his eyes fixed on the window that faced toward the rear of the property. Toward the witch house. "What in God's name was that?" Blackwood demanded, rising to his feet. His medical instincts urged him toward the source of the cry, toward whatever suffering required his attention and skill. "Nothing." Nathaniel replied too quickly, his voice higher than normal. One of the kitchen boys likely scalded himself. "Nothing for you to concern yourself with, doctor." But his hand trembled as he reached for the decanter, belying his casual explanation. "That was no kitchen accident," Blackwood insisted. "Someone is in serious distress. As a physician, You should finish your brandy and prepare to return to Charleston." Nathaniel interrupted, his tone hardening. "It's growing late, and the roads can be treacherous after dark. Our overseer will see to any injuries among the servants." The tension between them stretched taut as a bowstring. Blackwood knew he was being dismissed, knew that pressing the issue would likely end his welcome at Raven's Rest. Yet the scream had awakened every professional instinct he possessed, along with a deeper human concern that transcended social niceties. Someone on the Bellamy plantation was suffering terribly, and Nathaniel's transparent lie suggested the family's involvement, or at least knowledge, of the cause. "I think perhaps I should speak with your father before departing," Blackwood said carefully. "If there has been a serious accident, father is occupied and cannot be disturbed." Nathaniel cut in, rising from his chair with surprising speed for his stocky build. "I insist. Doctor, your horse will be brought around immediately." Blackwood made his excuses shortly thereafter, recognizing that further resistance would only close doors he wished to keep open. Nathaniel summoned a slave to escort him to the front of the house, where another servant had already brought his horse. The night had grown cool, a mist rising from the fields to veil the distant trees in ghostly white. The moon, just past full, cast enough light to illuminate the path back to Charleston, though shadows pooled beneath the live oaks lining the drive. As he prepared to mount, a movement at the side of the house caught his attention. A figure in pale clothing darted between columns, heading toward him with evident purpose. It was Victoria, her white dress billowing around her like a cloud in the moonlight. Her dark hair, usually confined in elaborate styles, hung loose around her shoulders, giving her the appearance of a much younger woman, or perhaps a spirit from local folklore. "Dr. Blackwood," she called softly, glancing back toward the house as if fearing observation. "A moment, please." Blackwood stepped away from his horse, meeting her in the shadow of a massive oak. Up close, he could see that her eyes were wide with an emotion he could not immediately identify. Fear, perhaps, or excitement, or some complex blend of both. Her breathing was rapid, her cheeks flushed. Most striking was her scent. Beneath the expected floral perfume was something metallic and sharp, like copper or iron, like blood. "Miss Bellamy," he began. "I heard a disturbance. Is everything?" "You must not come here again," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the end of the hall where a servant stood watching. "Father, the things he does, you cannot know. Please, for your own safety, forget me." Her fingers clutched his arm with surprising strength, the nails digging into his sleeve with enough force to reach the skin beneath. Up close, Blackwood noticed something he had missed during their previous encounters. Tiny markings at the edge of her hairline, partially concealed by artfully arranged curls. They appeared to be tattoos, or perhaps scars, forming patterns similar to the symbols on the silver teacups. "Victoria," he said softly, concern overriding formality. "Are you in danger? If someone is hurting you—" She laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Hurting me? No, doctor. I am becoming. We are all becoming." Her gaze shifted over his shoulder toward the rear of the property, where the witch house stood. "But not everyone survives the process. Not everyone is worthy." "What process, Victoria? You're not making sense." Blackwood placed his hands on her shoulders, trying to ground her in reality. Beneath the thin fabric of her dress, her skin felt fever-hot. "The covenant," she whispered, leaning closer, her lips almost brushing his ear. "The older ones demand sacrifice in return for their gifts. Father promised them 13 souls by the dark of the next moon. Tonight was a preparation." She pulled back slightly, her eyes meeting his with desperate intensity. "He sees something in you, doctor, something useful. If he invites you to a ceremony, refuse. No matter what he offers, no matter how tempting, refuse." With those cryptic words, she hurried away, leaving Blackwood more intrigued than deterred. As he rode back to Charleston beneath a waning moon, he resolved to discover what secrets the Bellamys were hiding at Raven's Rest. Victoria's warning, far from frightening him away, had awakened the same investigative spirit that had driven his research in Edinburgh. A need to understand the hidden mechanisms behind observable phenomena, no matter how disturbing those mechanisms might prove to be. The road back to Charleston was unusually quiet that night. No other travelers passed Blackwood, and even the nocturnal creatures of the woods and fields seemed to have fallen silent. The only sounds were his horse's hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through Spanish moss, draping the ancient oaks like tattered shrouds. Several times he had the distinct impression of being watched, of eyes following his progress from the shadows beside the road. Once, a movement in his peripheral vision caused him to rein in sharply. But when he turned to look, he saw only mist drifting between moonlit trees. He reached the outskirts of Charleston just after midnight. The city's perimeter was marked by scattered farmhouses and the occasional tavern catering to travelers. As he passed one such establishment, the Sailor's Rest, a commotion erupted, raised voices, the crash of breaking glass, and then a figure staggering out the door and collapsing in the road directly in Blackwood's path. The doctor reined in sharply, dismounting to examine the fallen man. In the spill of light from the tavern's open door, he could see it was a sailor, his clothing bearing the salt stains and tar marks of his profession. The man's face was bruised, blood trickling from a split lip. But what caught Blackwood's attention was the expression of terror in the sailor's eyes. "Help me!" the man gasped, clutching at Blackwood's coat. "They're after me. They know I saw." "Saw what?" Blackwood asked, glancing toward the tavern. Several men stood in the doorway, watching, but making no move to approach. Their stillness was unnatural, their silhouettes oddly uniform, despite differences in height and build. "The ship," the sailor whispered. "Bellamy's ship. The one that docks where no harbor master records it. I was on watch last night. Saw them unloading. Not cargo, not proper cargo. People. Chained people, but not slaves for selling. Something worse." His eyes darted past Blackwood, widening further. "They're coming. God help me. They're coming." Blackwood turned to see three men approaching from the direction of the tavern, moving with the same eerie synchronicity he had observed among the servants at Raven's Rest. Their faces were expressionless, their gazes fixed on the fallen sailor with predatory focus. One carried a coiled rope, another a heavy cudgel. Straightening, Blackwood positioned himself between the approaching men and the injured sailor. "This man needs medical attention," he said firmly. "I am Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, and I am taking him under my care." The men stopped, exchanging glances that seemed to contain an entire silent conversation. The one with the cudgel spoke, his voice flat and mechanical, like that of the slave who had greeted Blackwood at Raven's Rest. "This matter does not concern you, Doctor. The man is drunk and disorderly. We are merely returning him to his ship." "His injuries suggest otherwise," Blackwood replied, helping the sailor to his feet. "If he has committed some offense, take it up with the proper authorities. Until then, he is my patient." For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might turn violent. The three men moved closer, forming a semicircle that blocked the road to Charleston. Blackwood tensed, acutely aware that he was outnumbered and unarmed, save for the surgical instruments in his medical bag. The sailor trembled beside him, clearly too injured or frightened to be much help in a physical altercation. Then, unexpectedly, the men stepped back. "Very well, Doctor," said the spokesman, his tone unchanged despite the concession. "But Mr. Bellamy will hear of this interference." With that, they turned and walked back to the tavern, moving in unsettling unison. like puppets controlled by a single set of strings. Blackwood helped the sailor onto his horse, then led the animal the remaining distance to Charleston. The injured man slumped in the saddle. By the time they reached Blackwood's modest home and surgery on Trad Street, the sailor had lapsed into semi-consciousness, muttering about yeas in the darkness and the hungry ones beneath. After settling his patient in the small room reserved for those requiring overnight observation, Blackwood examined him thoroughly. The external injuries were minor, bruises and contusions consistent with a tavern brawl. But the man's pulse was rapid and thready, his skin clammy despite the warm night. Most concerning were his pupils, contracted to pinpoints despite the dim lighting, suggesting he had been drugged. Blackwood administered a tincture to help the man sleep, then sat at his desk to record the evening's events while they remained fresh in his memory. As he wrote, connections began to form in his mind. The Bellamy's strange behavior, the peculiar condition of their servants, Victoria's cryptic warnings, and now this sailor's terror and the unnatural men who pursued him. Something was happening at Raven's Rest that defied conventional explanation, something that apparently extended to Thaddeus's shipping operations as well. The following week, Blackwood found himself treating Elijah Parker, a Charleston merchant who supplied imported goods to many of the region's plantations, including Raven's Rest. Parker was suffering from gout, a common ailment among the well-fed merchant class. But as Blackwood wrapped the affected foot, the conversation turned to the Bellamys. Parker was a corpulent man in his 50s, with a florid complexion and small, shrewd eyes that missed little. His counting house on the waterfront handled everything from French wines to English textiles to spices from the Far East. Unlike many merchants who specialized in particular goods or trade routes, Parker dealt in whatever promised a profit, earning him a reputation as both flexible and somewhat unscrupulous. If a customer wanted something, anything, Parker could obtain it, provided the price was right. Damnable affliction, Parker muttered, wincing as Blackwood wrapped the affected foot in bandages soaked in a solution of willow bark and other herbs. The joint was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin red and shiny with inflammation. Comes from living too well, they say, though I notice it's never the aesthetes who make such judgments, always the fellows who enjoy their port and beef as much as I do. Blackwood smiled politely at the attempted humor. It's certainly aggravated by rich foods and alcohol, though there seems to be a hereditary component as well. Did your father suffer from similar attacks? Father, grandfather, great-grandfather, Parker confirmed. Bellamy is the only man I know who seems immune to the family curse. Despite maintaining one of the finest wine cellars in South Carolina. He shook his head in obvious envy. Strange folk, he added, wincing as Blackwood adjusted the bandage. Been supplying them for 15 years, and I still don't understand how they've managed it. Managed what? Blackwood asked, keeping his tone casual while his interest sharpened. Here, perhaps, was another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of the Bellamy mystery. Their success, Parker replied, reaching for the glass of watered brandy. Blackwood had permitted him as a concession to the pain of treatment. Thaddeus arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single ship that was barely seaworthy. Now look at him, one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. And during the war, when everyone was struggling, Raven's Rest only grew. It ain't natural. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully, applying a final layer of bandage before securing it with a pin. I've heard Mr. Bellamy is quite shrewd in his business dealings. Parker snorted, a sound of profound skepticism. Shrewd is one thing. This is something else. His ships never encounter pirates. His crops never fail. His investments always, and I mean always, turn a profit. During the British occupation, when most of us were losing everything that wasn't nailed down, he somehow convinced the English officers to leave his property untouched. At the same time, he was feeding information to the Continental Army. Should have been hanged as a spy, but instead he emerged from the war richer than ever. The merchant leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. And have you noticed how the man hardly seems to age? I swear he looks the same now as he did when I first met him. He paused, taking another sip of his brandy. My father used to tell tales of the old world, of men who made pacts with the devil for wealth and long life. Sometimes I wonder, surely you don't believe such superstitions? Blackwood said with a forced laugh, though his mind raced with the possible implications. His own research in Edinburgh had led him to explore folklore and mythology alongside more conventional medical texts, seeking parallels between ancient beliefs and modern science. While he dismissed much as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, certain persistent patterns across cultures had given him pause. Perhaps not. Parker conceded, settling back in his chair. I'm a practical man, Doctor. I deal in goods that can be weighed and measured, valued and sold. But there's something else. Something that happened back in '82 that always troubled me. There was a slave revolt planned at several plantations along the Ashley River. Someone betrayed them, and the ringleaders were captured. Most were executed publicly as a warning to others with similar ideas. He paused again, his shrewd eyes clouding with unease. But the ones from Raven's Rest. Thaddeus insisted on handling their punishment personally. Took them to that old stone building on his property. No one saw those men again. But for weeks afterward, smoke rose from that building day and night. And the smell. Parker shuddered. The smell was not of burning flesh, Doctor. It was something sweeter. More cloying, like flowers rotting in summer heat. Blackwood finished his treatment in silence, his mind racing. As a man of science, he was reluctant to entertain supernatural explanations for the Bellamy phenomena. Yet he had seen enough at Raven's Rest. The servant's unnatural behavior, Thaddeus's reflection moving out of sync with his physical form, the strange tea and symbols. To know that something beyond conventional understanding was occurring. Whether it involved actual demonic pacts or merely obscure scientific or alchemical knowledge, he could not yet determine. But the pattern of disappearances centered around the witch house suggested that whatever the Bellamys were engaged in, it involved human subjects, or perhaps human sacrifice. The sailor's terrified words came back to him. Not cargo, not proper cargo, people, chained people, but not slaves for selling. Something worse. Were the Bellamys importing individuals for some dark purpose beyond ordinary slavery? And what was the covenant Victoria had mentioned, with its demand for 13 souls by the dark of the next moon? That evening, he penned a letter to a former colleague at Edinburgh University, inquiring about any research connecting occult practices to the American colonies. While he waited for a reply, he continued his investigations locally, speaking with anyone who had dealings with the Bellamys or Raven's Rest. From the harbor master, he learned that ships owned by Thaddeus often returned from the Caribbean with cargo that was unloaded only at night by Thaddeus's personal slaves, rather than the usual dock workers. From a retired midwife, he heard that Constance Bellamy had not aged a day in 20 years, and that during the birth of her youngest child, the midwife had glimpsed strange markings covering Constance's entire body. Markings that seemed to shift and move in the candlelight. Most disturbing was his conversation with Reverend James Sullivan of St. Philip's Church. The elderly clergyman had been in Charleston for over 40 years and remembered when Thaddeus first arrived. Sullivan was a small, stooped man with hands gnarled by arthritis and a face deeply lined by decades of Charleston's harsh summers. Despite his physical frailty, his mind remained sharp, his blue eyes bright with intelligence beneath bushy, white eyebrows. Blackwood found him in the church's small library, cataloging donated books with painstaking care. Thaddeus Bellamy. Sullivan mused when Blackwood broached the subject. "No, there's a name I haven't discussed in many years, not since the unfortunate business with Levo." "Levo?" Blackwood prompted, the name unfamiliar to him despite his extensive inquiries. "Henry Levo," Sullivan clarified, placing a marker in the volume he had been examining and giving Blackwood his full attention. "A Frenchman from Saint-Domingue. He arrived with Thaddeus in 1760. They were inseparable at first, partners in their shipping venture." This was new information. In all his conversations about Thaddeus's origins, no one had mentioned a business partner. "What happened to him?" Blackwood asked. Sullivan's eyes clouded, his gaze turning inward to some troubled memory. "They were inseparable at first, partners in their shipping venture. But after about a year, Levo disappeared. Thaddeus claimed he had returned to France, but there were rumors. He trailed off, his gnarled fingers worrying at the cross around his neck. Rumors that Levo had discovered something terrible about his partner and threatened to expose him." "What sort of discovery?" Blackwood pressed, sensing he was finally approaching the heart of the mystery. Sullivan shook his head. "I cannot say with certainty, but shortly before his disappearance, Levo came to me in a state of great distress. He spoke of ancient rituals, of sacrifices made to entities older than Christianity. He claimed Thaddeus had brought something with him from the old world. Not an object, but a knowledge. A way of communing with these entities. He was afraid, Doctor, truly afraid." The Reverend's voice dropped to a whisper. A week later, parts of a dismembered body washed ashore near the harbor. The head was never found, so identification was impossible. But I have always wondered. Sullivan fell silent. After a moment, he continued, his voice steadier. "Levo left something with me for safekeeping. A journal written in French. He said if anything happened to him, I should ensure it reached the authorities. But when I attempted to fulfill this promise after his disappearance, I found the journal had been stolen from my quarters. The lock on my desk had been forced, and only that item was taken." "Do you recall anything specific from your conversations with Levo?" Blackwood asked. "Any names or terms that might help me understand what Thaddeus brought with him?" Sullivan hesitated, glancing toward the church's stained glass windows, as if seeking divine guidance on whether to continue. Finally, he nodded, having apparently reached a decision. Levo mentioned an organization, the Order of the Eternal Dawn. He said Thaddeus had been initiated into its mysteries in London before coming to the colonies. The order worshipped beings they called the Ancient Ones, or sometimes those who wait beyond. Their ultimate goal was immortality, achieved through rituals that Levo found abhorrent. "And you believe Thaddeus continues these practices at Raven's Rest?" Blackwood asked, trying to connect this information with what he had observed and learned. "I cannot say with certainty," Sullivan replied carefully, "but I have never accepted invitations to visit Raven's Rest. Despite Thaddeus's generous donations to our church, there is something in that man's eyes, Doctor, something that does not belong in a child of God." He reached out, gripping Blackwood's wrist with surprising strength for one so frail. If you are investigating the Bellamys, proceed with extreme caution. The power Thaddeus wields may not be supernatural in origin, but it is real nonetheless. His influence extends throughout Charleston society, into government offices and trading companies, even into the church itself. As Blackwood departed St. Philip's, the Reverend's warning echoed in his mind. He had come to Charleston seeking a fresh start, an opportunity to pursue his research without the constraints and prejudices he had encountered in Edinburgh. Instead, he had stumbled upon a mystery that hinted at practices far darker than anything he had explored in his previous work. In early June, Blackwood received a response from Edinburgh. His colleague wrote that there were indeed accounts of occult practices in the American colonies, particularly in New England during the previous century. He enclosed copies of several documents, including an anonymous journal dated 1692, the year of the Salem witch trials. The journal described a group called the Order of the Eternal Dawn, who sought communion with the older ones, those who dwelt in these lands before mankind crawled from the sea. The journal was written in a spidery hand, its ink faded to brown with age. Blackwood spent an entire evening poring over it, translating the archaic English and deciphering passages where water damage or time had rendered the text nearly illegible. What emerged was a document of profound disturbance. The record of a man who had infiltrated the Order of the Eternal Dawn with the intention of exposing their blasphemies, only to find himself drawn into their mysteries despite his initial revulsion. According to the journal, the order had been founded in England during the previous century, but had established a significant presence in the Massachusetts Bay Colony by the 1680s. They operated under the guise of a philosophical society, attracting educated men who chafed at Puritan restrictions on intellectual inquiry. Their true nature, however, was far from philosophical. They speak of entities that existed before God's creation. The journal recorded, beings of such power and age that our human concepts of morality and sin mean nothing to them. These older ones, as the order names them, are said to dwell in dimensions adjacent to our own, separated by a veil that can be pierced under certain conditions. The rituals I have witnessed involve attempts to create such conditions, to open doors that were sealed by divine providence. The journal described ceremonies conducted during specific astronomical alignments, when stars formed at patterns that the order believed weakened the barriers between worlds. These ceremonies invariably involved blood sacrifice, initially animals, but eventually human victims, usually indentured servants or Native Americans, whose disappearance would raise few questions among colonial authorities. Most disturbing were the accounts of what happened when the ritual succeeded. Something came through. The journal recorded after one such ceremony. I cannot describe its form, for it seemed to shift and change with each movement, defying the constraints of flesh as we understand it. Those who gazed directly upon it fell to their knees, blood streaming from their eyes and ears. Yet Magistrate H. approached it without fear, offering the blood he had collected in a silver vessel. In return, the entity touched his forehead with what might have been a limb or a tendril, leaving a mark that glowed like hot iron before fading to a pattern of scars. According to the journal, the order had been driven from Massachusetts following the Salem witch trials, which had begun when one of their rituals went catastrophically wrong, resulting in several young women of the community being exposed to energies that drove them to madness. The afflicted girl's accusations, though directed at innocent parties, had created enough scrutiny that the true cultists were forced to flee south. Most disturbing was the description of the order's inner circle drinking a tea made from a plant native to the Caribbean, which allegedly slowed aging and allowed communion with the entities they worshipped. The tea, brewed under the dark of the moon and mixed with a few drops of human blood, is said to gradually transform those who consume it regularly. They become something, neither fully human nor fully other. The journal explained. Their outward appearance remains unchanged, save for a certain agelessness, but their inner nature is altered beyond redemption. They no longer dream as men dream, but see through eyes not their own when they sleep. They hunger for experiences beyond mortal pleasure, and they hear the voices of the older ones always, whispering promises of power and knowledge in exchange for service and sacrifice. The journal ended abruptly in mid-sentence, suggesting its author had met with an untimely end before completing his account. Accompanying it was a letter from Fraser expressing his professional opinion that while the document contained obvious elements of religious hysteria and superstition, certain details aligned with other accounts of occult practices in colonial America. Most notably, Fraser had found references to similar rituals in documents from Haiti and Jamaica, where African religious traditions had mixed with European occultism to create syncretic practices focused on communication with powerful entities. "I need hardly remind you, my dear Blackwood," Fraser wrote, "that our scientific understanding of consciousness and its potential remains woefully incomplete. The mind is capable of perceiving realities beyond our conventional senses, a fact demonstrated by the effects of certain compounds on brain function. Whether the entities described in these accounts have objective existence or are merely projections of the collective unconscious under the influence of psychoactive substances, I cannot say with certainty. But I urge caution in your investigations. Knowledge that shifts our fundamental understanding of reality can be as dangerous as it is valuable, particularly when that knowledge has been jealously guarded by those who would use it for their own advancement." That night, Blackwood dreamed of Victoria Bellamy. In the dream, she stood at the edge of a dark pool, her white nightgown billowing in an unfelt breeze. The water of the pool was black as ink, yet seemed to glow from within, illuminated by lights that moved beneath its surface like enormous fish or serpents. As he approached, Victoria turned to him, her face transforming from beauty to horror, her skin splitting to reveal something ancient and inhuman beneath. From the fissures in her flesh emerged tendrils of darkness that reached toward him, promising knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension. He awoke drenched in sweat, the image still burning in his mind. Outside his window, the first light of dawn was breaking over Charleston's rooftops, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that belied the darkness of his dream. As he rose and prepared for the day's appointments, Blackwood knew that despite his growing unease, he could not abandon his investigation. Too many lives might depend on uncovering the truth about the Bellamys and their cult. Despite his growing unease, Blackwood could not stay away from Raven's Rest. He continued to manufacture reasons to visit, treating minor ailments among the household and laborers. A slave with a persistent cough provided the perfect excuse to examine living conditions in the quarters. A kitchen maid who had burned her hand while preparing dinner allowed him access to areas of the main house, normally closed to visitors. Each visit yielded small but significant observations, symbols carved into door frames, patterns in the decorative tiles that echoed the markings on the silver teacups, the way certain rooms seemed colder than others despite the summer heat. During these visits, he attempted to catch glimpses of the mysterious stone building that Parker had mentioned, but it was situated deep within the property, away from the main house in areas where Blackwood was permitted to go. On several occasions, he considered slipping away from his escort to explore further, but the constant watchful presence of the Bellamy slaves made such an attempt too risky. These servants, with their blank eyes and mechanical movements, seemed to materialize whenever Blackwood strayed from his expected path, gently but firmly directing him back toward approved areas of the plantation. His interactions with the Bellamy family during these visits were equally constrained. Thaddeus was frequently absent, attending to business in Charleston or traveling to his other properties along the coast. Constance received him with cool politeness when he called to check on her migraines, which she claimed were much improved thanks to his previous treatment. Nathaniel avoided him entirely, making himself scarce whenever Blackwood arrived at Raven's Rest. Victoria, who had so captivated him initially, now seemed to deliberately keep her distance. Though he occasionally caught her watching him from windows or through partially open doors, her expression unreadable. It was during one such visit in late June that Blackwood encountered Thomas, the youngest Bellamy son. Unlike his father and siblings, Thomas seemed uncomfortable with the family's position. He was a sensitive boy, more interested in poetry and music than plantation management, where Nathaniel carried himself with the arrogant confidence of a young man secure in his inheritance and position. Thomas moved through Raven's Rest like a visitor, hesitant and watchful, as if expecting censure for any misstep. Blackwood found him sitting beneath an oak tree near the formal gardens, reading a volume of Milton's Paradise Lost. The boy was so absorbed in the text that he didn't notice Blackwood's approach until the doctor's shadow fell across the page. Thomas started, slamming the book closed with a guilty expression that suggested he expected punishment for his literary interests. "Are you fond of Milton?" Blackwood asked, taking a seat beside the boy. He kept his tone conversational, recognizing in Thomas a potential ally, or at least a source of information less guarded than the other Bellamys. Thomas nodded, relaxing slightly when it became clear that Blackwood was not going to confiscate the book or report his reading habits to Thaddeus. "I find comfort in his words," he said softly, running his fingers over the leather binding. "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Sometimes I feel that way about Raven's Rest." "How so?" Blackwood asked gently, careful not to push too hard too quickly. The boy was clearly troubled, and Blackwood's medical training had taught him the value of patience when dealing with distressed patients. Thomas glanced around, ensuring they were alone. The garden was empty, save for a distant slave pruning roses, too far away to overhear their conversation. "This place, it changes people. Father Nathaniel, even Victoria, they speak of the family legacy, of power and knowledge passed down through generations. But I've seen what that legacy demands." He shuddered, his young face suddenly appearing much older, lined with worry and fear. "The witch house, they take people there. People who disappear." "What happens in that building, Thomas?" Blackwood leaned closer, sensing he was finally approaching the heart of the mystery. The boy's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not supposed to know. I followed Father and Nathaniel one night last year, during the dark of the moon. I saw." He trailed off, his young face contorted with the memory. There was a man tied to a stone table. They were chanting, Father and Nathaniel and Victoria and Mother, all wearing red robes. And there were others there too, families from Charleston, whose names you would recognize. They cut the man, collected his blood in a silver bowl, and then something came out of the shadows behind the table. Something I couldn't see clearly, but that moved wrong, like it had too many limbs, or not enough. Thomas buried his face in his hands. I ran. I've never told anyone what I saw. Father would. He would say I need to be initiated. That I'm old enough now to join the order. But I don't want to. I dream about it. That thing in the shadows. It speaks to me in my sleep. Tells me I belong to it. He looked up at Blackwood, his eyes pleading. You have to help me, Doctor. I need to get away from here, before the next dark moon. That's when they'll come for me. Blackwood placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling Thomas tremble beneath his touch. The young man's terror was palpable, and Blackwood had no doubt he was telling the truth about what he had witnessed. When is the next dark moon? July 11th. Thomas whispered. Less than 2 weeks from now. They're planning something special. Father says the stars will be aligned just right. They've been bringing in people for weeks now, keeping them in the cellar beneath the witch house. His voice dropped even lower. I heard Father telling Nathaniel that this ceremony will be the culmination of decades of preparation, that the older ones will bestow their greatest gift upon the faithful. The secret of transformation. Transformation into what? Blackwood asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Something beyond human. Thomas replied, something that doesn't age or die. Father says it's the next step in our evolution. But, he shook his head. I've seen what happens to the servants they choose for special duties. They come back changed. They move differently. Their eyes don't track properly. And they obey without question, no matter what they're ordered to do. The boy clutched Blackwood's arm. I don't want to become like that. I don't want to lose myself. Blackwood's mind raced, processing the implications of Thomas's revelations. The strange behavior of the Bellamy servants, the eerie synchronicity of their movements, the vacant expressions. These were not symptoms of drugging or hypnotic suggestion, as he had initially theorized. Something far more fundamental had been done to these people, something that altered their very essence. I'll help you, Thomas, he promised. We'll find a way to get you safely away from here before the ceremony. But even as he spoke, Blackwood wondered how he could possibly extract the boy from a household that seemed to observe every movement, where the servants themselves might be extensions of some inhuman will. Before Thomas could respond, Victoria appeared on the path before them, her face a mask of calm that did not reach her eyes. She wore a simple, walking dress of deep blue, her dark hair coiled at the nape of her neck in a style that emphasized the elegant length of her throat. Around that throat, her silver pendant gleamed in the dappled sunlight filtering through the oak's branches. Thomas, Mother is asking for you, she said smoothly, her voice betraying no hint that she might have overheard their conversation. And Dr. Blackwood, I believe my father wished to speak with you before you depart. Thomas shot Blackwood a frightened glance before hurrying toward the main house, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Victoria watched him go, her expression softening momentarily, with what might have been genuine concern for her younger brother. Then she turned to Blackwood, and any trace of humanity vanished from her features. Her eyes, which had once captivated him with their intelligence and depth, now seemed fathomless, like looking into a well that descended to the center of the earth. You've been asking questions about my family in Charleston, she said without preamble. That is unwise. Blackwood stood, meeting her gaze despite the chill that ran through him at her transformation. The Victoria he had danced with, whose wit and beauty had so entranced him, seemed entirely gone, replaced by something colder and more alien. I'm concerned, Miss Bellamy. For you, for Thomas, for all of you. Whatever your father is involved in, you know nothing of my father or our ways, she interrupted, her voice suddenly harsh. We preserve knowledge that would burn the minds of ordinary men. We commune with powers that existed before your Christian God was ever dreamed of. Victoria, Blackwood said softly, using her given name deliberately, trying to reach whatever remained of the woman he had admired. This isn't you speaking. Whatever influence your father has over you. Influence. She laughed, a cold sound that sent shivers down Blackwood's spine. I am a Bellamy. The blood of the covenant flows through my veins. I have tasted eternity, Doctor. Once you have done so, nothing else satisfies. She stepped closer, her perfume mingling with another scent, something metallic and ancient. I could show you. Father sees potential in you. You could join us. Become one of us. Live for centuries instead of decades. At what cost? Blackwood demanded. The lives of innocents. Your own humanity. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Doubt perhaps, or a glimmer of the woman Blackwood had first met. For a moment, he thought he might be reaching her, breaking through whatever conditioning or transformation had altered her nature. But it was quickly extinguished, like a candle snuffed by a cold wind. Her face hardened, cheekbones becoming more prominent beneath skin that suddenly seemed too tight, as if something else entirely was wearing Victoria Bellamy, like an ill-fitting garment. Humanity is a brief candle, Doctor, she said, her voice taking on a strange resonance, as if multiple speakers were using her vocal cords simultaneously. What we offer is an eternal flame. She turned away, her movements suddenly too fluid, too precise to be entirely natural. Do not come here again, unless you are prepared to embrace our path, and stop filling Thomas's head with notions of escape. There is no escape from what we are. As she walked away, Blackwood knew he had to act quickly. Thomas was in danger, and perhaps others as well. Whatever ritual the Bellamys and their cult planned for July 11th, he had to prevent it. But how could one man stand against an organization that had operated in secret for generations, that counted among its members some of Charleston's most influential citizens? The answer, he realized, was that he couldn't, not directly. He needed allies, evidence, and above all, a plan that did not rely on confronting the cult's supernatural patrons on their own terms. If there was one thing his scientific training had taught him, it was that even the most seemingly mystical phenomena had underlying mechanisms that could be disrupted, if properly understood. Back in Charleston, Blackwood attempted to interest the authorities in investigating Raven's Rest, but without success. The Bellamys were too well connected. Their donations had filled the pockets of every official in the region. When he spoke of human sacrifice and dark rituals, he was met with skepticism or outright derision. One magistrate even suggested that perhaps Blackwood should seek treatment for his own mental state, implying that the Charleston climate sometimes adversely affected those not born to it. These are serious accusations, Dr. Blackwood, the magistrate said, leaning back in his leather chair with an expression of barely concealed amusement. Thaddeus Bellamy is one of our most respected citizens. His contributions to this community are beyond question, and you expect me to believe he's conducting human sacrifices on his property, based on what evidence? The testimony of his own son, Blackwood insisted, and the mysterious disappearances of laborers from Raven's Rest. Speak to Elijah Parker or Reverend Sullivan. They have concerns as well. Parker is a gossip and a drunk, the magistrate dismissed, and Sullivan is a doddering old man whose mind wanders more often than not these days. No, Doctor. I think what we have here is a case of an overactive imagination. combined with perhaps a touch of professional jealousy. He smiled thinly. After all, the Bellamys don't lack for anything, do they? While you, a newcomer to our city, are still establishing yourself, it's only natural to wonder how others achieved what you yourself desire. Only when Blackwood mentioned the sailor who had witnessed unusual unloadings from Bellamy ships did the magistrate's demeanor change. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold watchfulness that reminded Blackwood uncomfortably of Thaddeus himself. "I think we've discussed this matter long enough," the magistrate said, rising from his chair. "Let me offer you some friendly advice, Doctor. Charleston is a close, knit community. Those who prosper here understand the importance of discretion and respect for their neighbors' privacy. Continue spreading these wild tales, and you may find your medical practice suffering accordingly." His smile returned, but it did not reach his eyes. "No, if you'll excuse me. I have actual criminals to deal with." As Blackwood left the magistrate's office, he noted a carriage waiting outside. A black conveyance with the Bellamy crest emblazoned on its door. The driver sat motionless on the box, his face partially concealed by the brim of his hat. But Blackwood could feel the man's eyes following him as he walked away. The message was clear. The cult's influence reached into the very institutions that should have opposed it, and his efforts to seek help through official channels had only alerted his enemies to his intentions. Realizing he would have to act alone, Blackwood began to prepare. From his medical supplies, he took a pistol, several scalpels, and a vial of laudanum, a tincture of opium that could render a man unconscious if administered in sufficient quantity. These he packed carefully in a leather satchel, alongside bandages and other items that might prove useful in treating injuries. From Reverend Sullivan, he borrowed a silver crucifix and a vial of holy water. Though he doubted their efficacy against whatever ancient power the Bellamys served, Sullivan provided these items without question, his rheumy eyes suggesting he understood more than Blackwood had explicitly stated about his intentions. "May God protect you, my son," the elderly clergyman said as Blackwood prepared to leave. "And remember, even in the darkest night, faith can be a light to guide your path." Most importantly, he acquired a detailed map of the Raven's Rest property from a surveyor's office in Charleston. The clerk was initially reluctant to provide such information, but a generous consultation fee loosened his scruples. The map, yellowed with age but still legible, showed not only the main house and outbuildings, but also the network of paths and roads that crisscrossed the plantation. Blackwood noted the location of the witch house and the various approaches to it, mentally calculating the best route for an unobserved approach. The days leading up to July 11th passed with excruciating slowness. Blackwood maintained his normal routine, seeing patients and attending social functions, all while feeling as if he were moving through a dream. The ordinary concerns of Charleston society, gossip about engagements, business deals, discussions of politics and fashion, seemed impossibly trivial compared to the horror he knew was unfolding at Raven's Rest. Several times he found himself staring at his fellow guests at dinners or card parties, wondering which of them might be members of the Order of the Eternal Dawn, which seemingly respectable citizen might have participated in the rituals Thomas had described. He made one final attempt to contact Thomas, sending a carefully worded note via a former slave, who now worked as a free man, delivering messages and small packages throughout the Charleston area. The note, ostensibly about a medical text Thomas had expressed interest in, contained a coded message suggesting a meeting place where they might discuss escape plans. The messenger returned with no response, reporting that he had been turned away at the gates of Raven's Rest by guards who seemed unusually alert and suspicious. On the night of July 10th, Blackwood rode out from Charleston, timing his journey to reach Raven's Rest after midnight. He wore dark clothing, his face smudged with ash to reduce its visibility in the moonlight. The pistol was loaded and primed, tucked into his waistband within easy reach. In his pockets were the vials of laudanum and holy water, along with a small pouch of salt, an element the journal had mentioned as being anathema to the entities the cult worship. The night was oppressively hot, typical of Carolina in July. Cicadas droned in the trees, their rhythmic pulsing creating an alien soundscape that seemed appropriate to Blackwood's mission. The sky was clear, stars blazing with unusual intensity, as if the heavens themselves were observing the events unfolding below with particular interest. The moon, just past its last quarter, provided enough light to navigate by without exposing him unnecessarily. Raven's Rest emerged from the darkness as he approached, its white columns ghostly in the starlight. The main house was largely dark, with only a few windows illuminated on the lower floor. Blackwood avoided the main drive, instead circling through the fields until he reached a small copse of trees half a mile from the house. There he tethered his horse, ensuring the animal had water from a nearby stream before continuing on foot. Moving from shadow to shadow, Blackwood made his way across the plantation grounds. The slave quarters were dark and silent, unusually so for a summer night, when the inhabitants would typically be taking advantage of the cooler evening hours for socializing. No voices raised in conversation or song, no children playing in the dirt yards between cabins. The stillness was unnatural, suggesting that the occupants were either absent or restrained in some way. Following the map, Blackwood approached the witch house from the rear, using a line of decorative shrubs for cover. The stone building loomed before him, a squat, windowless structure that seemed to absorb the starlight. Despite the heat of the night, the air around the building felt noticeably cooler, as if it generated its own microclimate of perpetual autumn. A faint glow emanated from beneath the heavy wooden door, and as Blackwood crept closer, he could hear chanting from within. A rhythmic, guttural sound in no language he recognized. Finding a position behind a gnarled oak tree, Blackwood settled in to wait and watch. The chanting continued, rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to induce a trance-like state in both participants and listeners. Despite his scientific skepticism, Blackwood found himself swaying slightly to the rhythm,